Morning, guys. This is Chapter 27, Republican Resurgence and Decline. Make sure to go to the website and get the notes for this. There's several videos that I've included about this. Stuff about the presidents, stuff about the Depression, all that sort of stuff. Alright. Remember that the last president had been a Democrat, and Wilson had led us through the war, so forth and so on, being a big idealist. This chapter deals with the Republican resurgence and how the Republicans then take office for a series of terms. The election in 1920, most Americans were weary of Wilson's crusading idealism. We talked about this in class, about how he spent more time, worried about the situation over in Europe, which was fine, and that made him a good leader, and it kind of made him more of an international president than a domestic president, and the debate we got into in class and so forth. Now, what's going to happen is people are going to look for normalcy, as the title says right there, and Warren G. Harding, a senator from Ohio, that's going to be what he runs on. All right, he comes off as this sort of simple, average guy, everyman sort of character. And his big thing is, we don't need the idealism, we don't need all this sort of stuff, because realize they're sort of disillusioned following the war and all the sort of bad stuff that happened. And so he says, hey, we're going to get back to just doing our thing. All right? Here you can see Harding up here. As you read the chapter, I imagine Warren G. Harding would be something like if Joe Biden had won the presidency and was a Republican, but he seems like a knucklehead. Besides Harding, the Democrats get James Cox and Teddy Roosevelt's cousin, FDR, to form their ticket, but due to the popularity of Harding and the fact that the Dems are beginning to split amongst sort of socioeconomic stuff or regional stuff, the South and the urban areas are beginning to split their party. You see the Republicans take this 16 million to 9 million in the popular vote. Early appointments in policy, they had a lot in common. Harding had a lot in common with Ulysses S. Grant. He appointed some really capable people, but at the same time he also had a little bit of cronyism in him, which means he appointed his buddies. Some of the better appointments: Charles Evan Hughes to the Secretary of State, Herbert Hoover to the Secretary of Commerce, Andrew Mellon, the head of the Treasury, Henry Wallace, head of Agriculture. Some of the bad: Albert Hall, who your textbook will point out, will be sent to prison for the stuff in the Teapot Dome scandal. Same thing with Attorney General Harry Daughtry, which will not be sent to prison, but will be almost prosecuted for the same sort of stuff. Now, most of this stuff stems from the Teapot Dome scandal, and we'll get to that here in a slide or two. Now, Warren Harding, being from Ohio, had what they referred to as the Ohio Gang. So think about it like as his crew of friends, his buddies. And the Attorney General, Harry Daughtry, was sort of the head of that. And supposedly they would get together at the White House and drink some illegal booze and play some poker and just have a good old time. There's the age-old story that Harding gambled away the White House silver or china or whatever. I don't know if that's true, but it makes for an interesting story. One of the things that Harding and Coolidge are kind of going to set forth doing is getting rid of a lot of the stuff that the Progressive era had established, and not necessarily outrightly, more so in a sort of going through the system kind of way. So one thing he does is he appoints Howard Taft to be part of the Supreme Court. You remember Howard Taft from a few chapters ago? His thing wasn't about limiting things. He was a referee between business and Congress and stuff like that. He wasn't an active guy. So he even talks about how he was appointed to revert a couple things. And so Warren G. Harding's administration is going to take a pro-business tone. There's going to be spending cuts, so the government's not going to spend as much money, and there's going to be tax reductions. And he's going to lobby for something that eventually also gets passed in the 1980s when Ronald Reagan pushes for tax cuts for the rich. And the idea was, if you cut taxes for the rich, they have more money than to create business, to use it as capital to employ people, so forth and so on. It's often referred to as trickle-down economics. You give people money at the top, and it'll find its way to people at the bottom. Most people don't think it works quite that well, and the tax cuts tend to be more of a deal for, political support. Also, they're going to want to put high tariffs on imported goods. So remember this going forward, the high tariff. All right, we'll talk about the hotly smoot tariff at the end of the chapter, and that's going to kind of cause some problems. Now, also to the fact is that the United States has shifted its standing in the world. We're no longer a debtor nation. We're not borrowing money. We now loan money to people, namely after World War I and during World War I. So, other countries owed us money, but the problem was the tariffs made it difficult for those other countries to pay us back because they couldn't trade with us. We were a big consumer, and so they wanted to trade goods with us and get money and then pay us the money back, but we didn't want to trade with them. Well, we wanted to trade with them, but we made it difficult for them. Also, they're going to be more lenient on government regulation. So, all of those committees and commissions and all that sort of stuff that was created during the Progressive Era. So, like, even though it doesn't mention this so much in the chapter, think about like the Food and Drug Administration that's there to inspect meat and all that sort of stuff. The idea would be that instead of having a very stringent person in charge of that, now they would have maybe a more lenient person in charge of that. And so a lot of these appointments go to guys that are going to be a little bit more laissez-faire towards big business, kind of let them do their own thing, and they won't get really involved in it, which will allow more business, but at the same time will maybe not be as good for the American consumer. Administrative corruption. One of the things it talks about in your book is how some guys like Henry Cabot Lodge and, I'm trying to think of some of the guys off the top of my head and I don't remember them, but they were like true Republicans and they believed in less government. All right, that was one side of it. The other thing was Harding's cronies and buddies in the Ohio gang weren't really, philosophically down with republicanism. They were more so excited about lining their own pockets. So by deregulating and doing all this sort of stuff, it gave them opportunities to graft off the top or to embezzle, however you want to look at it. So that was what more they were about than, say, true republicanism. Daughtry, for example, gets called on the floor for fraudulent handling of German assets after the war. Mainly, was he yet again using them for his own gain? And one of the interesting things that's going to come out of that case is that Congress will be able to. It sets a precedent for Congress to actually call people in to hear testimony from them. So think if you've ever seen The Godfather, where Corleone has to go in and discuss his activity in organized crime or racketeering or whatever you want to call it. And so the precedent was set way back when in the 1920s with Daughtry and his fraudulent handling of German assets. Now, also during this time period, you get the Teapot Dome scandal. The quick version of that was that Teapot Dome was out in Wyoming, and underneath it there were petroleum, there was oil. And so Hall basically sold, Albert Hall sold the oil or petroleum that was the Navy's to private businesses without going through the proper procedures and without having an open bidding for it, which means other companies can bid and see if they can get a lower rate. The government can get a better deal by opening it up to competition. Well, he didn't do that. He sold it to his buddies, and he was also bribed. You would think this would stick to Warren G. Harding and people would hate him, but, all it did was kind of not endear him to people, but he was a beloved guy at the time. And he had his whole quote you'll read about in your textbook about how he can handle the enemies. It's his friends that kind of screw him over. And so people could yet again relate to that. Now, the deal was, though, in 1923, he headed out to the West Coast to check out Alaska. And in Seattle, he had food poisoning. And then, I want to say it was like a couple days later in San Francisco, he passed away in his hotel room. Which was kind of tough for the country because he was such a beloved guy. And so initially there was this huge outpouring of grief, and everybody couldn't understand why such a good guy had to go. But over time, he kind of became more of a figure that people not disliked, but kind of lamented more so the fact that because all this sort of bad stuff came about, about corruption and all this sort of stuff came out after he passed away. Now, following this, Calvin Coolidge, his vice president, is going to be sworn in to be the president. It's kind of an interesting story. He's going to be sworn in by his father at 2:47 a.m. out in Plymouth, Vermont. All right, and Coolidge was a much more uptight kind of type of Republican, not as sort of a free spirit as Warren G. Harding. And he's going to have yet again more of the Gilded Age idea of the presidency. He's going to be a guy that defers to Congress, let the businesses do its big thing, all right? Which we know can run us into some issues, but at the same time, it does give business the leeway to grow. Now, following his little bit of a term there, or year in the office after Harding died, Coolidge runs for the presidency again in 1924. The interesting thing, though, was his opposition. There's a joke in there by the humorist Will Rogers that says, I'm a member of no organizational political party, I'm a Democrat. What you had going was that manifestation of the 20s, where you had rural ideas, and you had people like in the South, which had always been Democrats after the Civil War, and then you had progressive types in urban areas, all right? So, and you can still see this somewhat today in certain folds in the Democratic Party. It's more of a bigger issue in the Republican Party splitting between really conservatives and normal people. But the Democratic Party at this time had a big split, and so they couldn't really basically decide on anybody. Now, the Farm Labor Coalition is also going to nominate a guy for president and form a new progressive party, and that's going to be everybody's favorite Wisconsinite, I don't know what they are, Robert La Follette, or Follette, I don't know how you say it, and he's going to be, yet again, progressive, which means he's going to be for workers' rights and all that sort of stuff, and he's going to get supported by the Socialist and the American Federation of Labor, which is going to make him eyeballed as, like persona non grata, like he's in with the anarchists and those, greasy immigrants kind of thing, which isn't really the case, but that was how people saw him. All right, Coolidge wins handily in the election. It really wasn't much of a contest. All right, his phrase, his title or campaign slogan or whatever, "Keeping Cool with Coolidge," got it done. Now, during this time period, there was a great leap towards, yet again, the modern era. I know I've said that a bunch about this stuff following the Gilded Age and all that sort of stuff, but it's really the truth. This is what's kind of pushing us into the modern age. All right, business leaders were sort of vindicated about the progress that society had made and all the stuff that we had and how people's lives were better. All right, and also the average person, who for so long had been swept up in the fact that, we had to have workers' rights and all this sort of stuff, was now getting sidetracked or maybe enticed by the consumer corporate culture, all right? Or basically they were into all the new stuff, and they were amazed by it. And it finally reached the point where it was becoming affordable for the average person. So there were new goods and new products, and it was all thanks to this newfound efficiency, which we've kind of mentioned before, where factories now made stuff at a lower cost, which means they could sell it at a lower cost, and people now had jobs, and so they could buy it, and it worked out. And so, you can see here in the picture, Ford and the Model T assembly line, and, all that good stuff. The example I was trying to find for you guys that I couldn't actually do very well was the candy industry is a good example of this through the 20s. Up until, the 1920s, candy wasn't, like, super expensive, but you bought it in little pieces. Like the Hershey's Kiss came about in the 1910s or whatever, and that was like a piece of candy kind of thing that people bought for 10 cents or whatever it was. But in the 1920s, it explodes, and they have like, a zillion different types of candy bars, Baby Ruth and, or maybe I'm wrong with that, maybe that's later, but like Reese's Peanut Butter Cups and so forth and so on. And the reason for that was people had more money, and it was easier for them to create them. And this goes around all over the place, all right? It's not just candy or cars or clothes or whatever. It becomes, all this stuff becomes available to the average person. Also, at the same time, since businesses could create all this stuff, they needed people to purchase all this stuff. So you see the rise of marketing and advertising, all right? And so the problem was, up until this point, like the main thing for people was to live like this plain lifestyle and austere and be like a good American kind of thing. Well, now it's kind of pushed it away to now the idea of purchasing things, taking you away from the plain living notion and idea. Your textbook's going to talk about how the ideas of people feeling better about buying stuff, you know, that still goes around today with the concept of retail therapy. Another big movement during this time period was going to be the improvements in communication. All right, and it talks about how it created a more homogeneous national culture. And this is really true. You know, what happens is, with the advent of the radio and movies and so forth and so on, people now know and can share experiences that are similar across the entire nation. You know, if you liked Charlie Chaplin, which your textbook will talk about, in, you know, Los Angeles, you could like him in New York, and you can know what they're talking about in Dallas, Texas. It's all the same, all right? You all have an understanding of that. Nowadays, we live in such a time period where communication is instantaneous. So, you know, yeah, we all live roughly the same sort of lives. We might have different, like, hamburger places, but we all have basically the same common culture in the United States. And a lot of that hadn't been that way up until this point. So, with the advent, yet again, of Charlie Chaplin, the Keystone Company, also the Keystone Cops is a common term you might know, movies were created, and they took over. It was like every town at some point had like 3 or 4 movie theaters in it, because people went to the movies to get the news, to be entertained, so forth and so on. And rich and poor alike also were sort of democratized in the liking of the movies. Radio also came around at this time period, and so in 1927 they made the Federal Radio Commission, and eventually that turned into the FCC, and President Coolidge was the first president to address the nation via radio, and then your textbook will talk about FDR's fireside chats, which we'll get to eventually. Now, besides communication, also the movement of people and goods got faster and better, all right? First you get the Wright brothers, and you know, in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, figuring out a way to make a plane fly. All right, there's a video in your notes about that. Also, you have eventually Charles Lindbergh flying across the Atlantic, I think to Paris. And the interesting thing in here is his Spirit of St. Louis. The fuel tanks for it were so big that they covered up the windshield, so he had like a weird little periscope thing that he had to fly with. And Lindbergh's going to fly over there and become this like national, international celebrity. Eventually, though, unfortunately, one of his children is going to be kidnapped, and it becomes this huge big deal. And unfortunately, they find it murdered, and they eventually capture the people. But it was a huge like court case and sort of big deal in the country that people followed in the news and so forth. The biggest invention, though, during this time period for the democratization of travel would be Henry Ford and the Model T. All right, yet again, video in the notes. And the assembly line made the car cheap for people to purchase. All right, the car didn't have a lot of frills, and up until that point, cars were very, very intricate and almost sort of like craftsman-type products, where, you know, you think about like some company over in London creating a coach kind of thing that people rode around in. Well, you know, they might have 3 or 4 workers that work on it around the clock for a few months, and then they produce a car. Henry Ford decided to use the ideas of the assembly line to make the car cheaper. Now, the interesting thing is, the jobs on the assembly line, although sought after, were boring and monotonous. And so, to keep people doing them, Henry Ford actually had to pay his workers a considerable amount of money, and he actually basically elevated the wages of the average factory worker because his jobs were so boring. Now, what else? Stabilizing the economy. Hoover, as I said, supported Herbert Hoover, yet again, the head of commerce, all that sort of stuff, supported growth and trade organizations for stabilization. The idea there was, if, you know, you owned a hamburger stand, you could talk to other hamburger stands and let them know how many hamburgers you sell, and they could tell you how many hamburgers they sell, and then you could roughly know how many hamburgers are being sold, so you could maybe sort of predict stuff and know how many people to hire and so forth and so on. So on one end, the sharing of information was okay because it helped companies plan better, all right? And the courts backed this up. They said it's all right to share information, but you cannot collude. Collude is basically we're going to get together and say, I'm going to sell hamburgers at $100 and you're going to sell hamburgers at $100, so if people want hamburgers, they got to pay $100, right? Price fixing kind of thing, which is really, really bad. And it's a big, big no-no in the economy. So that also, though, snuck in there from time to time. Yet again, takes you back to the ideas of the holding company and that sort of collusion, cartel stuff going on. Now, the business of farming. Farming, although it being sort of a not little person, but rural thing going on by families, now moved into more of a commercial type setting. You had mechanization added, tractors and farm equipment that made it easier for farmers, at the same time made it also more expensive at times. And so farmer organizations, namely co-ops, what they would do is they would kind of pool their stuff together to represent either one type of commodity or one area, and they could then work for better prices. All right. Now, your textbooks can go into a whole thing about crop surpluses and how they try to deal with them by basically forcing their surplus crops on the international market and kind of holding the U.S. ransom and stuff, and it never goes through. But just realize that the United States, being such a large country and having such a large area to grow crops, can grow a ton of them. So the example we would use is, in the United States, the federal government actually pays farmers to not grow certain things. So what would happen is, you know, if we grew as much, say, wheat, if we wanted to, we would actually make the price of wheat go down because we grew too much of it, because it would then not be as valuable. So the government pays subsidies to people not to grow wheat, right? At the same time, it also pays money for companies to grow certain stuff. So like certain types of corn are used to make ethanol. And it's kind of interesting, if you use enough, they switched to enough farmers making ethanol for corn for ethanol purposes that they didn't have corn for other purposes. And so some farmers had to switch back, and that's a bit of a story, and we can talk about it later. Setbacks for the unions. Workers' lives had gotten better, and their pay had gotten better, and they were like better off than most people in the world working in the United States. There was the advent of technology, which began to take away some jobs, which is going to be a sort of slow march to the present. At the same time, it did create jobs. You needed people to run the machines and or, you know, fix the machines and so forth. At the same time, people started to move away from unions. All right, they associated them with strikes and anarchy and, yet again, socialism and communism, which, if you remember the Red Scare after World War I, people were very anti that. So the open shop idea, or the American idea, all that sort of stuff, where companies have the right to hire people and fire people, so forth, without unions, comes into being. And today in Texas, we're referred to, it was called to a right-to-work state, which is, we're not very pro-union down here. But nonetheless, that was the period of time going on right there. All right, President Hoover, engineer. Hoover versus Smith, all right? Coolidge talks about passed out these weird little pieces of paper saying he wasn't going to run again. And Herbert Hoover was incredibly popular. Remember, he had run the Food Commission or whatever it was during World War I and been very successful. He was one of the guys in charge of commerce during the Roaring '20s, right? So he looked like a very strong candidate, and he was very, very popular as well. So he's going to run against Governor Alfred Smith of New York. Yet again, remember, Democrats have a divided thing. You got progressives in high urban areas, like, say, New York City, and then you have the rural South also supporting Democrats. So they were going to struggle to get a consensus there. Now, Alfred Smith was a Democrat from New York who happened to be Catholic, and that's going to be a big question going forward. Now, it's not going to be until JFK till we get a Catholic president. Because most of these people, especially guys in the South too, they're going to see Smith as being associated with, yet again, parts of Europe that would have brought Catholicism. So think Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, you know, sort of just the nativism, racism stuff that we've already talked about. So that's going to be something he's going to have to fight against. Even though he was a very capable, clever guy, it was hard for him to get over that. All right. Now, it's going to be a landslide victory for Hoover. It's going to be 21 to 15 million, an even worse lopsided victory in the Electoral College, 444 electoral votes to 87. And like I was saying, it was going to be difficult even in the South for Smith. So Hoover even won the Solid South, part of the Solid South, which is the first for a Republican in years. Now, with Hoover in control, one of the quotes in there, it talks about it, is he had no fears, or I have no fears for the future of our country, which was kind of a tough thing going forward, because clearly there's some big clouds on the horizon. Now, it'll talk about how Hoover, really kind of gets a raw deal with the Depression, because he was a progressive guy. It talks about how he was, against racism. He was, kind of moving everything forward. He just kind of gets pooped on by the Depression. Right? He was a humanitarian. He had started to do stuff like the Ad Marketing Act, which set up the Federal Farm Board, which provided $500 million to loan to these farm co-ops that we talked about. One of the big mistakes he makes is he goes along with the Hotly Smoot tariff due to his political affiliations. The Republican Party wanted it. Yet again, the idea of foreign goods being too easily available, hurting our economy. Not to get too sanctimonious on you, but a big proponent of free trade. And so tariffs in general are a bad idea all around. And then when they're really high, it's really difficult for anybody, because then people selling stuff in the United States can raise their price because they'll still be cheaper than stuff coming in from outside of the country. And so he follows along with it because the Republican Party wants it, and it was a mistake. Okay, the tariff becomes too high yet again, and it's going to deaden trade with Europe, and the economy starts to slip out of control. Most people didn't fear a Great Depression; they just saw it as a hiccup, which sometimes that's what it is. All right. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case. In 1927, people had been investing their money in stocks, and the value of the stock market began to soar. And so it was like a very, very clear investment or clear idea that, hey, we should put our money in the stock market. It's just going to go and become more money. So if you had $100, you invest in the stock market, a few weeks, maybe it's $150, you take it out, you got $150, right? It's a good deal. Well, thanks to the fact that there were more government tax reductions, so people had more money, so they invested more of it in the market, people, much like, say, the credit crisis, began to speculate, and they buy on a margin, which means they basically loaned, they bought stock with money they didn't have, and it was loaned to them by the brokerage house. Usually what happens is, okay, I'm going to, I have $50, I'm going to buy $500 worth of a thing. It'll go up, I'll sell it, and then I'll pay back the difference, the $450 I owe, off the profit I make from selling the stock. Well, what happened is, on October 29th and so forth, I think it was 27th actually, and through the 29th, the market starts to slip. All right, and think about it this way: if you've invested a lot of money that you don't actually have, you're going to freak out when all of a sudden the money that you don't have is now worth less than it was when you invested it. We'll talk about it in class if you don't understand what I'm saying. The values of these stocks began to tumble. And so if you had owned, let's say, something like Apple stock last year, right, it was like $500-something a share. A few months ago, people began to question Apple's strength. They didn't make as much money as was projected, and it began to slip. The price began to slip. Now, if you had got in when Apple was like $50 a share, you're really not concerned about it because you got a huge profit. But if you got in at like $500, you're like, dude, this sucks, I'm losing money. So you might sell your shares. Well, if enough people begin to sell their shares, the whole market begins to sell their shares. And so the shares then become less valuable. And so people freak out. They then worry about their money, and they go to try to take it out of the bank, so it runs on banks, all that sort of stuff. One of the things that happened, though, is there was an agreement where banks tried to pool their money to halt the slide. And that worked for a little bit. Nowadays, what would happen is the government would step in and bail them out in certain instances. Now, we're not going to get into the right or wrong or nature of all that sort of stuff. We can talk about it in class, but those are the types of reasons why the government does bailouts, is because of stuff now in the from the Great Depression. All right, there had been lax regulation. There was less foreign investment because people saw, yet again, there's the high tariff, and they saw the stock market as a better deal. And so once it all kind of begins to slide and kind of tumble towards, a depression, Mellon, who's the Secretary of the Treasury, decides to make the idea, which was not a horrible idea at the time, to liquidate the system, to sell off your stuff and hold on to whatever money you can, and it will, as your textbook puts it, purge the rottenness out of the system. And that's what happens in a market. You have you have something that becomes overpriced, people stop buying it. It purges the system until the price comes down, or people that are doing poor business practices go out of business, so forth and so on. And so there would be a market correction. That's what they thought would happen. But instead, what happened is they slipped farther and farther and farther into a depression, which does happen when you have grown to such heights. It was kind of like a roller coaster. Now, the human toll of the depression, in 1933, there were 13 million people out of work. Talked about how homeless people would wrap themselves up in blankets, in newspapers, and they referred to them as Hoover blankets, and at the same time, people started to make these little shanty towns in public spaces referred to as Hoovervilles. Alright, now, one of the things was that Herbert Hoover, yet again, like his Secretary of Treasury, thought it was a market correction. And so if people just kept positive and upbeat and hopeful, eventually the problem would run its course and the economy would turn around. And so if you just kind of stuck it out, you'd be okay. But that really, for the short term, wasn't going to get it done. So he tried to accelerate government building projects. Not much different than, say, what FDR does with the Tennessee Valley Authority and Public Works and stuff like that, except on a smaller scale, clearly. The problem was it was offset by offset by state cuts. So if the federal government had done something, the state might have also cut whatever it was, so it was kind of balanced out. Right? Realize the federal government's large at this point in time, but not until after FDR will it get to even larger heights. So he's not quite dealing with as big of a deck as FDR was. Now, the Federal Reserve tried to make it easier to borrow money to, again, turn around the problem. And at the same time, the hotly smooth tariff was still crushing trade, and they hadn't repealed it yet. Now, congressional initiatives, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation was going to be established to provide emergency loans to banks and businesses and insurance companies. Also, the Glass-Steagall Act was enacted to increase availability of commercial loans for people, yet again, to start businesses. The idea was people spend the money, they start the business, they give people jobs, and it would get the economy rolling again. They released more money from more gold from the Federal Reserve, hoping that yet again make the value of money more. The Home Loan Bank Act, yet again, was established to help people pay their mortgages. Hoover wanted to do everything except for starting welfare. He did not want to make a dole, is what it's referred to as. So eventually, he begrudgingly signs the Emergency Relief Act, which would help with the payment of loans and issuing loans. But he did not want to get to the point where they just gave out money to average citizens. But that was actually what people were calling for. All right. Now, the last little bit is about farmers and veterans in protest. I'm going to let you read that on your own. There's some interesting stuff in there about future General MacArthur and Dwight D. Eisenhower and them putting down riots and stuff like that. It's kind of not entertaining, but it's interesting. I will see you guys in class, and we will talk about how this reflects what happened in the United States back in 2008. See you then.